Gary, the first question that I have for you is that I speak to a lot of finance people on a day-to-day basis. No one else sounds like you. No one else looks like you. No one else is saying the things that you're saying. Why is that?
Because social mobility is dead, basically. To get a job in like elite finance, which is, I guess, the people you're probably speaking to, you need an elite degree from an elite university, and it's very, very difficult to get those if you don't come from a relatively well-off background. And then even if you do, it's then very difficult to get the job. So I was a smart kid, and I got into London School of Economics, very prestigious university. And even then, like my plan was to get the best grades and then get the best job. But the way to get a job is you need to get an internship in your second year of university, which is quite conspicuously before the grades are given out. Which means that the jobs are given out basically based on like extracurriculars and who you know.
Your
And
handshakes.
yeah, I mean, and you can imagine, right? I was going to university with like Gaddafi's kids. You know what I mean? You can
Wow.
imagine what their extracurriculars were like when I was like trying to become like a grime MC and fluffing pillows in a sofa store. You know what I mean? So it's a little bit of a rigged game, unfortunately. Which it's worth pointing out. That's a phenomenal waste. And I think the second thing to point out is if you're not putting the best people in those jobs, then maybe the people in those jobs are not always that good, unfortunately.
So, Gary, you've come to New Zealand and Australia, and obviously there's a lot of interest in what you're saying. Otherwise, you wouldn't be coming here. You're keeping an eye on the audience numbers and everything like that. So, one thing about New Zealand is that property is a constant debate. We're talking about it all the time. It's the national pastime to be talking about property. But what we don't have is a capital gains tax, and we're quite unique in the developed world in that sense. At the same time, home ownership rates are declining over time. And yet we still have this reluctance to accept a capital gains tax. There's now talk of one being introduced, but again, it's going to exclude the family home. So any capital gains that you have on the family home probably wouldn't be included in that. What are your thoughts on that lack of a capital gains tax, particularly when you look at the fact that home ownership, specifically with those younger generations, is declining over time?
I don't think it's a good policy to not have a capital gains tax, but it is like super understandable, and I'll explain why. Right? So my dad was born in 1957. He worked in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and he never made a lot of money. He was able to buy a home. My dad lived in the generation of you buy a home by working and saving your money. That's finished, right? Now house prices are like through the roof. I'm guessing you're spending $1 million to get like a decent house
A
in New
two-bedroom
Zealand, right?
apartment.
Yeah, exactly. This kind of thing. And then that's totally unaffordable for working people unless you have money from your parents, right? So we've created this economy now where basically housing is an inherited asset, which means the only way to get a house is for your parents to have a house. So what we've done is we've moved away from an economy where what matters is your job, what matters is your work, what matters is your salary, towards an economy where what matters is the assets that your family owns. So in that economy, it's totally understandable that people are going to say, whatever you do, don't tax my assets.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? This is totally understandable. The problem is, the reason assets are super unaffordable is because you have this super, super rich class that have enormous passive income that spend all their money on assets. It's really important to recognise New Zealand housing unaffordability is not a problem about New Zealand, and it's not even a problem about housing. Every single asset, look at every stock market in the world, right? First of all, housing is a problem everywhere. I could list
Yeah.
100 cities where housing is unaffordable in the world. But look at the stock market, look at the gold price, look at land prices. What you have is a global crisis of asset affordability, which is being driven by the fact that you have this incredibly rich class that have this enormous passive income that does nothing with it but buy assets. So but you have this super irony where the reason that people can't buy homes is because assets are not taxed. But they desperately don't want assets to be taxed because they want to keep hold of their own assets.
So it's
And the
almost like
key,
like clutching onto a dream that's diminishing while we're clutching onto it.
yeah, and the big thing is what you need to do, and is you need to tax the assets in particular of the very rich. You need to focus on the very rich.
So the other thing that's happened at the same time is that the premium that you get from an education, a tertiary education that is,
Yeah.
the earning premium that you get from that has declined over time too. So you could be starting out your life with a $50,000 student loan. House prices have increased in price during that time, and then you're likely to earn a lower premium on the enormous expenses that you've put into that education. So, in terms of like a young person entering the world in that context, what do you do?
This is the big question, right? I had a friend ask me the other day, and I get asked this a lot. He said, he was a young man. I'm 39 now. He was much younger than me. And he said, he knows I've made money. He was like, Gary, what do I do? How do I get rich? How do I make money? And, I was like, if you want to ask me how to get like really hench, go to the gym. If you want to ask me how to learn Japanese, I'll give you the textbooks. You know what I mean? But the truth is, capitalism is kind of finished, right? Like I grew up in a very immigrant area of East London, right? And a lot of my friends, their parents came over from India, from Pakistan, from East Africa with nothing, worked really hard, bought property. That was possible in the 80s, in the 90s. That was capitalism. You work hard, you get assets. It's done now, it's finished, right? Houses cost £1 million, right? And the average income is like £30,000-40,000, right? And I'm sure you could do the equivalents in Kiwi dollars. It's going to be similar, right? Yeah. The truth is, there is only one reliable path to financial security or wealth nowadays, and that is have a rich dad. And if you didn't do that, you should try again, because then nothing else really works. And obviously, people will point to me and they'll say, "Oh, we'll do what you did." Number one, I did that 20 years ago, and number two, I was winning every math competition I was ever in. I obviously had this very particular gift that not a lot of people had. Right? It's just. So I think, if you're a young person, of course, like if you do have one particularly marketable skill, it makes sense to go to university, or maybe you just want to go to university. But I think the truth is, you have to be realistic with yourself, and we have to be realistic with the young, which is we have created an economy in which there is almost no realistic opportunity for young people to make money. And in that case, of course, university is a bit of a luxury.
On top of that, so New Zealand's old age dependency ratio is climbing. So in 1999, we had 5.5 workers for every retiree. By 2050, we'll have 2.6. So there's almost more pressure on those young people to be delivering productively in order to kind of maintain the system of superannuation, which is universal in New Zealand. How do you see that dynamic playing out if it isn't rectified or if it isn't sorted out?
It's going to be incredibly divisive. I'm sure you're seeing in New Zealand a similar thing which we're seeing in the UK, which is basically age has been for a while now, the number one most reliable predictor of how somebody votes.
Yeah. And
what you have here is older people who own property, who perceive themselves to have benefited from the very rapid increase in house prices that we've had over the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And then young people who see it from the complete other perspective, which is, oh my God, I can never buy a house. And, as we see the situation where older people tend to be a little bit of a bigger political cohort, they're very protected, they have high voting rates, they protect their pensions, as they continue to be protected, whilst, the young, in many cases, live in real poverty. This is the thing, and we have this, and the old don't see it, and they get told, it's because the young are buying too many cappuccinos and avocado toasts. One big message that I want to communicate when I'm out here is to older people in Australia, in New Zealand, to say, listen, mate, your house, maybe it costs $2 million now. Are you winning? Because how do you benefit from your house being worth $2 million? There's only one way you actually get any real life benefit from that, which is you sell the house.
Yeah.
And if you sell the house, where do your kids live if an average house costs $2 million? The only situation where an older New Zealander has benefited from those house prices rising is if they don't want grandkids.
Yeah.
Because if you sell that house, where are your grandkids going to live? So listen, I see this growing political rift and division between the young and the old. Listen, I firmly believe we can provide a good quality of living for both the old and the young, but only if we deal with this problem of growing inequality. It's as simple as that. And I don't want to see division. And I want the old to recognise that the complaints of the young are legitimate. They genuinely don't know, in many cases, how they're going to buy a house. But the problem you have is, some people have grandparents who have a lot of property wealth, and some people have grandparents who don't. So it's going to be incredibly divisive. And you have a country there in New Zealand, which I think prides itself on its egalitarian spirit. How is that going to be affected when the the financial fortunes of the young are totally dependent on whether their grandparents have two houses or not.
So, Gary, the one thing that is happening in New Zealand with younger people is there is a group that have kind of accepted that they will never be able to afford a house, and perhaps in the future, if they become really lucky, they will. But they're shifting what money they have from their income into alternative investments. That might be shares, it might be into gold, it might be into meme stocks. It's anything that they see online, basically, that might appeal. Index funds also incredibly popular right now. What's your view on that versus buying a house as early as possible, like previous generations did?
All right, listen, I've got stocks, I've got ETFs, I've got gold. I think these are, in general, they're good long-term investments. Obviously, there are risks involved. I think it always makes sense to buy these things. I think because young people have, in many cases, been trapped out of the housing market, we need to recognise that they've been forced into these. And in many cases, especially poor young people, might feel that they have a lot of financial pressure to choose particularly risky investment options because they know that 5-10% returns are not going to get them to where they need to be to buy a house, which is why you're seeing people, going into things like crypto and meme stocks and meme coins, all of which I think are incredibly dangerous investments I would never invest in. So look, obviously it's good for young people to have a degree of financial awareness, but let's not kid ourselves that this is like a new entrepreneurial spirit. These people are doing it because they're locked out of the housing market.
Yeah.
And really, when I hear these stories, what I hear is the kind of squid gamification of the economy, which is like the only way to win is to do some crazy gamble. That's the truth of it. We've created this situation where really what this comes from is the basic fact that work is not working. My dad worked a regular job, less than average income, and on that was able to buy a house and have a family. That is no longer true. And that's the big thing behind it.
Yeah, I think what people also miss is the fact that we've moved from a single to a dual income household, and things are still expensive. So your dad's generation, my dad's generation, it was pretty ordinary for there to be a single income household. Now you have the dual income household, and things are still so expensive. You're looking at not only that single income, but houses being multiple times the value of a dual income household. And there's no further room to move. We're not going to have 3 incomes in a house unless our living arrangements change entirely.
Yeah, I mean, but look, this is what happens when you create a super rich elite class. This is the thing, that the first thing which becomes visible is unaffordability of assets. Because what do rich people buy with their income? They buy assets. And if they, I'm not super rich, right? But, I can own 5 houses. You know what I mean? And how many mortgages can I own? You know what I mean? And these guys, billionaires, if you have $1 billion, you're making $1 million a week passive income. And that's just $1 million, right? And if I have $1 million a week passive income, I don't have a choice but to buy at least $950,000 of assets every week. I can't spend more than $50,000 a week. That would be insane, right? So if you're going to have this billionaire class, basically you have a choice. Do you want a billionaire class or do you want affordable housing? You cannot have both. You cannot compete ordinary people against billionaires and expect ordinary people to own assets.
Gary, you would have rubbed shoulders with a lot of very wealthy people in your time, far more than what I would have rubbed shoulders with, far more than what the average person rubbed shoulders with. What is it that drives them to keep wanting more? Because one thing that's always struck me, as somebody who has never had extreme wealth or been around extreme wealth, I've always felt like if I made a certain amount of money, I would just stop and enjoy my life. What stops them from stopping and just enjoying their lives? Like, what is this obsession with having more and more and more and more and more? What drives them?
So have you seen the film American Psycho?
Yes.
There's one little, I like that film, but there's one little scene in that film where, which I think is really telling, right? And he's in the back of his car listening to his music, and and then his girlfriend says to him, "Why don't you just quit? You hate that job anyway." And he takes his one earphone out and he says, "Because I want to fit in." And then this is the thing you need to understand, right? So most of the rich people I've met in my life are traders, investment bankers, right? There are very few ordinary people going into that world nowadays. Most of the people who get that job come from very rich families. They went to elite private schools. They went to elite universities. All of their friends are the same. So these guys, they need to be making $1 million a year to fit in with their social circle.
Okay.
This is the thing. So for me, I made multiple millions of dollars in my top year, and that was just like mind blowing. I never heard of anyone to make that kind of money, and nobody in my social circle had made that kind of money. But for these guys, all of their friends and family, all of their community, they've monopolized those jobs. They're getting those incomes. They live very extravagant lifestyles. So and I'm sure it's the same. If you look at Elon Musk, he's comparing himself to Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The truth is, like, for you and me, we live ordinary lives. We think $1 million a year is like, a huge amount of money. But, these guys, we've created this separate class where everybody earns $1 million a year. And if you don't make $1 million a year, your wife's going to leave you. You know what I mean? You need that holiday.
So it's not only the individual's wealth that's increasingly moving across to US equities and into the stock market and things like that. So we have a policy called Kiwis Saver, where it's a kind of save as you go approach, where a certain percentage of your salary goes into investments every year. Generally, it's managed by a fund manager or a bank, and a lot of especially those who are in growth funds, a lot of that money ends up in US equities. So a lot of our wealth is being tied up in US equities rather than New Zealand businesses. Do you see any repercussions from that type of shift of money?
I mean, this is just the way things are going. Mm-hmm. Everyone is invested internationally. A lot of that sits in the US. I don't think it's necessarily a problem. I think I try and stay away a little bit from, especially the tech stuff, which a lot of, if you buy S&P 500, a lot of that is in there.
Yeah.
I've been focusing on high dividend stuff. I mean, obviously, you look at politics nowadays, things are becoming more fractured. Countries are turning inwards. I haven't turned around and said I'm going to trim back my international holdings.
No.
Whether it affects New Zealand, I mean, what it does create is it kind of creates this internationalism of wealth.
Yes.
Where people who have, wealth has no country. And then what it means is then you have this super rich class who can continue, they own everything everywhere, and they can continually say to every individual country, well, you can't tax us because I'm going to leave. The key thing I would like to, point out, especially to people from New Zealand, is, New Zealand is a country which has a lot of natural resources. A lot of the wealth is in natural resources and in property. The rich people can leave, those resources stay there. So I think you do need to consider, you don't need these rich people to live in your country. New Zealand will be a country where a lot of the country is owned by people overseas, and you can still tax them on the wealth they own in your country.
Well, because that is the interesting thing, because there are companies like Google and Facebook that have historically threatened to leave New Zealand should we change our tax rules, or should we legislate against some of the things that they're doing, and those threats have materialized to some degree in Australia. Not so much over here because we've moved a little bit slower in terms of regulating these companies. But if these companies were to leave, would that be such a bad thing? Would it be such a big problem as we imagine?
I mean, I'm sure you could figure out a way to replace Google. I don't think Google's gonna. I mean, look, lots of countries. China doesn't even allow Google in. Mm-hmm. I think you got these companies. They're incredibly powerful. Do you want your country to be heavily influenced by an international corporation that refuses to pay tax in your country? And you look, in the short term, if you need these companies, then you need these companies. But if they're holding your government to ransom, you should be thinking about how to go forward in the medium term with replacing them, I would say.
So much of the US market's currently being propped up by AI and software companies, to a lesser degree with the software companies that kind of came off their highs recently. But how much of a risk is there that we could see a crash or a significant correction in the coming months or in the coming year? And I suppose that the follow-up question is, off the back of crashes historically, we've seen markets recover over time. Is that something we can still rely on in the current context? Or is just because it's happened historically, it might not happen again?
I mean, a crash is undoubtedly possible. I don't think anybody would tell you that. When I was a trader, a very wise trader once told me, don't tell me your opinion, tell me your position. Mm-hmm. So I am quite long stocks in general. I'm focused on high div. I'm short the Nasdaq. I'm short Bitcoin. I don't like the tech stuff. It feels bubbly. AI feels incredibly bubbly. I've hated crypto for a long time, but in the long run, I think asset prices will continue to go up. It's the timing is tricky now, right? Because I've always been a big believer that asset prices will rise a lot because of growing inequality and because rich people like assets. The problem is, we're sitting here now, the performance of assets, of basically all assets over the last 1, 2, 3 years is insane. My big long was gold, and I was holding £1 million of gold. I can't hold £1 million of gold at this level, at this volatility. Well, it's hard to bring it down, to be honest. I was holding more. I think long run assets go up because whenever there is a market crash or an economic collapse, what happens? The rates come down to zero. Mm-hmm. And what that ends up doing is bailing out the asset holders. The pain always lands on the working people and it never lands on the asset holders. So I think long run assets, I'm a believer in that currency is being devalued and will continue to be devalued. Yeah. For that reason, you want to be long or even leverage long assets. But the big caveats are, one, I don't like AI stuff, I don't like tech stuff, I don't like crypto, so I'm short them against it. And two, given the rapidity of the rise in stocks broadly and gold over the last few years, you'd be incredibly reckless to go all in on it now. I've slimmed down. I'm sort of not super leveraged. I always like to be a bit leveraged. I've got cash on the sidelines. If there was a dip, I would be buying, but I wouldn't be buying AI. I wouldn't be buying tech. I wouldn't be buying crypto. That's not to say I think AI is not going to happen. It just feels incredibly bubbly. But crypto, I think, is a joke.
We currently also have this perverse situation where companies that are promising AI returns are being rewarded for basically firing people, reducing their headcount because it's the only way that they can show efficiencies. What's your view on that? Because my concern is that there comes a point where if AI's only promise is that it can lead to fewer people required to do the jobs that these companies want done, there comes a point where people don't have money to be able to buy the products that they're selling. So how do you see that balance playing out?
I think AI will be great for the rich, great specifically for the owners of the AI. I think it will be terrible for the rest. I think what it really, really does is just sharpen the need to deal with inequality. Yeah, really, it's as simple as that. It will lead to terrible poverty. I think there's sometimes a real naivety from economists about this, and they look back to the 19th century, the 1800s, and they say, oh, in the end it worked out fine. And they forget the enormous explosion in inequality that happened at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And that did work out well for British workers eventually, after decades, centuries of fighting for a better share. It didn't really improve living conditions significantly until after the Second World War, 100 years later. In places like India, which got deindustrialized, they remained poor for hundreds of years. I think there's a phenomenal naivety about how this will affect living standards. But I think what this message, I really want people to understand is, this is about who owns the wealth.
Yeah.
Improved productivity has no guarantee of improving living standards for the masses. It can lead to phenomenal concentration of power, and it can lead to massive increase in poverty. AI, if it delivers everything it's promised to deliver, some people have ridiculous promises, but it looks like it's going to deliver something. All it will do is increase inequality. All it will do is increase inequality. And it makes this fight over distribution and over taxation much, much, much more important.
Gary, one comment that I often hear from critics is that we should be happy about the era that we're living in because we have it better than previous generations had it. If you look back 100 years, if you look back 200 years, we have a more stable world. We're not fighting wars. We should be really happy with the gifts we've been given in life and stop complaining. What would your response be to that?
Yeah, tell that to the driver of the Titanic. It's luxury till they hit the iceberg. Listen, I'm well aware that living standards are much, much better now than they were 100 years ago, than they were 200 years ago. I'm well aware that we live in a good time in history. I'm also well aware that 30, 40 years ago, ordinary workers could buy homes and now they can't. I'm also well aware that when I was a kid, extreme poverty was pretty rare in London where I live, and now half the people struggle to turn the heating on and feed the kids at the same time. You know what I mean? Direction of travel matters. It's listen, You're driving off. Have you seen? There's a great French movie called La Haine.
No, I haven't. I will add it to my
It's a
list.
great movie. The opening scene tells a story. Have you heard about the guy who jumped off of a skyscraper?
No.
As he fell, every floor he fell past, he said to himself, "So far, so good. So far, so good. So far, so good." Listen, it's not the falling that hurts; it's the landing. You know what I'm saying? Listen, clearly poverty is increasing. Clearly inequality is increasing. Clearly housing is becoming less affordable. This is accelerating. This has the last 5-10 years it's accelerated enormously. I've made millions of pounds betting that this will happen, and by betting that it will accelerate and worsen. Right, so to say like things are better now than they were 100 years ago while you drive off the cliff is just utmost stupidity. Like, have a little bit of foresight. You know, stop looking backwards, look forwards to where we're going. Where we are going is massive increases in poverty in the UK, in New Zealand, in Australia, in America, all over the world. And I don't think that's a good situation to be in. And I don't want to keep making money by betting on the collapse of society and being right.
Gary, the last question that I have for you is on a wealth tax, because I mean a lot of what we've spoken about today is wealth and the accumulation of wealth and the idea that we have this group of people who have accumulated an enormous amount of wealth, right? So in New Zealand, we've also been very reluctant to introduce a wealth tax, and part of the argument there is that New Zealanders are worried that we're a small country and this will lead to capital flight, and that all those wealthy people that we need in the society will leave, and it'll lead to a drop in investment. What would your response be to that argument?
The most important thing is that you protect New Zealand's wealth. You protect the wealth of the country, and you protect the wealth of the people, and you protect the wealth of the government. So if you want to have some foreign billionaire who wants to live in New Zealand and spend a load of money and not own New Zealand assets, you can do that if you want. And you don't need to tax him, right? But if we're talking about somebody who's going to own hundreds of millions, billions of dollars of New Zealand assets and use the money from that to buy more New Zealand assets, if you allow that person to accumulate wealth untaxed, then what will happen is wealth will become unaffordable to New Zealand citizens. It's as simple as that. So the most important thing is protecting New Zealand's wealth. And that means not allowing billionaires to buy up that wealth untaxed. You know, New Zealand does not have an infinite amount of wealth. You know, it's not growing super quickly. You know, this age of super growth is over now. If you allow billionaires to grow their wealth at 10% a year, while your countries are growing at 2% a year, then what that means is ordinary people will lose their wealth. Look at the graphs of like government wealth of European countries over the last 50 years. It has collapsed. UK government used to own 100% of UK GDP equivalent of wealth. Now it's minus 100%. That is a real collapse of Britain's wealth, and it is owned now by super rich people. Look at the home ownership rate of young people collapsing in my country and in your country. Those homes are still owned. They're just not owned by regular Kiwis anymore. So listen, if you want to have like foreign billionaires living in your country, living the dream, spending money, not owning New Zealand assets, and you want to do that, I'm not going to complain. If you want to let them buy your assets and use the passive income to buy more of your assets, then basically you're being stupid and you're going to lose your wealth.
Gary, before you go, I know I said that was the last question, but I said one more. We have an election coming up in November. What's the one issue we should be looking for when it comes to choosing a politician?
Taxation of the super rich. Wealth inequality, distribution, protecting your wealth, taxation of the super rich. You want somebody who understands the connection between these things and is going to seriously say, listen, we are not going to allow the real wealth of New Zealand people to be bought up by billionaires, be they domestic or abroad. Protect your wealth. Do not allow the people who own your country to not pay tax.
Gary, thank you so much for your time, man. Really appreciate it.
That's all right. No worries. Nice to meet you.